mean, as you know, we've completed our review. It was a very thorough review, and the reviewers had the opportunity to interview everyone involved in this that was willing to be interviewed, obviously. But at the conclusion of the review, what we do know, and there's a couple of really important points to this, I mean, really sort of two main factors. The first is that the officers acted in accordance with the law, that they, based on the information that they received, had reasonable grounds to believe that Mr. Sansone was in possession of a weapon. And they acted with an abundance of concern, a sincere concern for the safety of the children involved. Having said that, during the review, what we did discover is that there was a miscommunication between officers during Mr. Sansone's detention. And that miscommunication had officers believing that he was then going to be charged with a criminal offense as opposed to still in the midst of an investigative detention. That miscommunication led Mr. Sansone to be thoroughly searched when he ought not to have been. That was a mistake on our part. And we fortunately had an opportunity to speak personally with Mr. Sansone on Friday. And at that time, and now publicly, we are in a position to apologize publicly to Mr. Sansone for not only being thoroughly searched when he ought not to have been, but more importantly, the difficulties that this has caused both him and his family in the aftermath. And while the officers acted again in accordance with the law and the legal proceedings and procedures that are incumbent upon them during the course of any investigation similar to this, what is important to know is that everyone, Family Children Services, the school board, the police, all acted with a sincere belief that children's safety was at risk, and they had a legal, moral obligation to act on that information. Again, notwithstanding the fact that there was a miscommunication during the course of that investigation that led Mr. Sansone to be thoroughly searched when he ought not to have. And we are sincerely apologetic and sorry that that occurred, but more importantly, the difficulty and harm that has caused him and his family in the aftermath.
Mr. Sansone has gone on record with us as saying he's considering his legal options. Where does that leave the Waterloo Regional Police?
It really doesn't change our situation at all. Mr. Sansone has every right to pursue some type of legal action or civil remedy, and nothing that we're saying here today will have a bearing on his rights, and we welcome him to pursue whatever he feels morally is the right thing for him personally.
There was a lot of criticism at the time that the decisions that were made by police were done solely on the basis of a drawing that a child made in a classroom. In reading the report, it seems to me there are other factors as well. I just want to give you the opportunity to comment on this.
Oh, thank you.
It wasn't just something in isolation.
At the beginning of this, as this was unfolding publicly, there were a number of misrepresentations in the media that would lead the community and people to believe that officers acted solely on the drawing of a 4-year-old. There was a number of pieces of information that came to the investigators at the time of this investigation, and based on all of those pieces of information, it led the officers involved to, on the balance, reasonably believe that Mr. Sansone was in possession of a firearm. We now know that he wasn't. But if you put your mind in the situation that the officers were in at the time, and believing the information that was coming forward, and there was a sincere belief on those that were presenting the information that the information was true, everyone acted at that moment properly and in accordance with their legal obligations. So it's unfortunate that as this was unfolding publicly, a lot of the information was either withheld or wasn't available for the public, and led most, if not much, of our community to conclude something that in fact was not accurate.
What specifically was withheld?
Well, there was a lack of information that, and really the lack of pursuit of information that would have we think, incumbent upon any journalist to ask a lot of questions with respect to procedures, legal procedures, as well as legal obligations and processes, but also understanding the business of policing. To suggest that police officers would arrest somebody and strip search them, and those are the words of the media, not ours, we don't use that language, but to suggest that officers would do that without any further investigation and without a journalist actually looking into a lot of the background information that was either provided or available, would suggest to me that this was more of an editorializing of actions as opposed to really uncovering what happened and in fact wanting to inform the community what occurred.
Mr. Sansone has a criminal record, and he's possessed from owning a handgun. Those were things that were taken into consideration when we made this decision.
That would have been part of the information that the officers would have had at the time, that would have, another piece of the information that would have taken them to the conclusion that, on balance, they had reasonable grounds to believe that Mr. Sansone not only was in possession of a firearm, but had committed a criminal offense.
There are a series of recommendations in the report. Some of them are tedious for a soundbite, and we'll forward to that. But if this series of circumstances were to play out again, and this drawing were to be made, what would happen differently the next time?
Well, the procedures that we have in place are sound in that we would go through this investigation as we would any situation that we have reasonable grounds to believe a criminal offense has taken place. If the safety of the public, safety of children are at risk, then if need be, the detention or investigative detention of a suspect or subject would have played out. The miscommunication is not something that occurred as a result of misconduct. It's not something that occurred as a result of disregarding the rights of an individual. In fact, the officers involved went to great lengths to protect the dignity and the respect for Mr. Sansone during the course of the investigation, and the report reveals that. At times going beyond what would normally be expected by a police officer. So when we look at how this would play out again, in the course of all of our lives, often we do either make a mistake or that we are involved in some miscommunication, and in this particular case, that miscommunication resulted in Mr. Sansone being thoroughly searched when he ought not to have been, and the obvious difficulties that has caused for him and his family afterwards. There are some recommendations there that are quite innovative when you think about it. Are there, using modern day technologies, are there better ways or less intrusive ways of doing thorough searches of subjects that come into our detention? That's something that I think we as a police service, and certainly policing in general, may want to give some thought to.